Beneath Canada's forests, rivers, and cities lies an unseen network of steel, one that fuels its economy and gives it political weight. You see, Canada is one of the world's largest energy producers, and crude oil is its moneymaker. Billions of dollars flow through its pipelines every year, but almost all of it, 98% in fact, goes straight to the United States. And while Americans are very progressive when gas is $1.50, they rediscover patriotism when it's higher. Now that Trump is abandoning free trade and leaning into protectionism, Canada's economic vulnerabilities have been exposed. Canada is so reliant on the US for its oil exports that even if a 10% tariff were applied, it would still have no choice but to continue selling to the US. So, having alternative buyers for energy exports is key. This 1,150-kilometer long pipeline, dubbed the Trans Mountain Expansion, does precisely that. It will bring Canadian oil to overseas markets. Opened in 2024, the project was cluttered in controversy, costing roughly $25 billion and lasting for over 12 years in development. But now, it's also more than just a pipeline. It's an opportunity to have a different conversation, reduce interdependency, and strengthen Canada's sovereignty. Amid renewed discourse sparked by Trump's rhetoric, there is a growing push to expand Canada's pipeline network, with Energy East and Northern Gateway emerging as key proposals. Projects such as these are needed to protect Canada's economic and political interests. But as Canada undergoes a crash course in geopolitics, it's about to find out that innocence is no shield, and ignorance is no excuse. In most advanced economies, being online every day is the norm, but staying connected can get really expensive when you travel abroad. That's where today's sponsor, Saily, helps out. Saily offers affordable data plans in more than 200 destinations across the globe. They do this with an eSIM, a digital version of a SIM card that's already built into most modern phones. It works the same way as a regular SIM, but you don't need to put anything into your phone. Just download the Saily app on your phone, pick a plan for the country you're going to, and turn it on right before your flight. When you land, you'll already be connected. It's easy to set up and cheaper than local SIM cards, and if anything goes wrong, Saily has 24/7 support. They'll even give you a refund if your mobile phone doesn't support eSIM services for some reason. What's more, by signing up, you will be supporting CaspianReport to make more content. YouTube ads alone don't cover production costs. We need sponsors to keep going. So go to saily.com/CaspianReport, download Saily, and use CaspianReport coupon code to get 15% off any of your chosen plans. Oil and gas make up 5% of Canada's economy, and it's one of the few growing industries in the country. Nearly all crude oil comes from Alberta in Western Canada, where the oil sands pump out millions of barrels of thick, tar-like oil every day. However, instead of going to buyers around the world, most of that oil is sent across the border to the United States, mainly to the Midwest. For a long time, Canada was okay with this. The United States is a massive market with an unrelenting appetite for energy, so both countries came to rely on one another. However, in recent times, this interdependency has become increasingly detrimental to Canada's interests, and not just because of Trump and his tariffs. Any nation that bets on one buyer gambles with its future, and operating in a single market has pushed down the price of Canadian crude oil. It's lower than it should be. Meanwhile, much of the global demand for oil is increasingly coming from Asia. Canada has been trying to sell more oil there for years. The problem, however, is that Alberta is landlocked. It is hundreds of kilometers away from either coast, making it difficult to ship oil overseas. The original Trans Mountain Pipeline, built in 1953, tackled this issue. It became the only means of transporting oil from Alberta to the Pacific coast for overseas shipments. Nevertheless, in the decades following, Canada's oil industry grew faster than its pipelines could handle. Exports to the United States increased accordingly, but a surplus of crude oil accumulated. In the last 10 years, for instance, oil production went from 3.7 million barrels a day in 2014 to well over 5 million in 2024. There was plenty of room to reach new markets. That is, if the capacity of the Trans Mountain Pipeline could be expanded. So, in 2013, energy giant Kinder Morgan proposed to upgrade the pipeline. At first, the expansion project was estimated to cost roughly $4 billion, but the price tag grew substantially over the years due to delays caused by protests from environmental and indigenous groups. In 2018, private investors eventually backed down, deeming the project too risky. Right then and there, the government stepped in and bought the pipeline from Kinder Morgan. The Trudeau administration had a grand strategic objective: rely less on the United States and sell oil overseas for better prices. Canada immediately began expanding its infrastructure. This included nearly 200 kilometers of reactivated pipeline, 19 new storage tanks, and 3 new shipping docks at the Westridge Marine Terminal near Vancouver. Altogether, the expansion tripled Canada's export capacity from 300,000 to 900,000 barrels of oil a day, just as Trudeau set his sights on markets in Japan, China, and India. Finally completed in May 2024, the expansion promises big returns. Estimates by the federal government say it will generate $73 billion in Canadian dollars for the producers over 20 years, while increasing government revenues by $46 billion in Canadian dollars. For context, this converts to $51 billion and $32 billion in American dollars. For Trudeau, the project's completion comes as a relief. His government was slammed by environmental campaigners for buying the pipeline in the first place. In 2020, protests escalated when Indigenous groups and activists set up rail blockades across Canada, which disrupted freight and passenger train services for weeks. The standoff put immense pressure on the government and forced emergency negotiations. These disruptions became symbolic of the broader movement against fossil fuel expansion. They reinforced the argument that increasing oil and gas production would hamper Canada's efforts to cut greenhouse gas emissions and reach net zero by 2050. It goes without saying that building pipelines in Canada has become increasingly complicated, and the Trans Mountain expansion may well be the last of its kind. Pipelines carve paths that politics cannot erase. While the Trans Mountain expansion has reduced Canada's interdependence, the United States is and will remain Canada's biggest customer. But that's not all. Canada also depends on the United States for domestic distribution. To clarify, Alberta has built a massive network of pipelines to send its oil to refineries and ports in both Canada and the United States. However, most of these pipelines either pass through or go straight to the United States, even Albertan oil designated for Eastern Canada. So it works like this: the oil used in Ontario and Quebec travels through a pipeline that runs from Canada into the United States and then comes back into Canada. And so Canada is dependent not only on the US single market for its exports, but also on domestic distribution. This is a bad hand to have with Trump in office. The only way Canada can overcome this is by building more pipelines to its coasts and reaching out to new buyers. Two previously cancelled plans, Energy East and Northern Gateway, keep coming up again now. The idea is to transport Albertan oil directly to the Pacific and Atlantic coasts and then export it around the world. Energy East is a 4,600-kilometer pipeline project that aims to transport more than 1 million barrels of oil a day from Alberta and Saskatchewan to refineries and export terminals in eastern Canada, primarily in New Brunswick. Meanwhile, Northern Gateway, 1,173 kilometers in length, looks to transport about 500,000 barrels of Albertan oil per day to a marine terminal in Kitimat, British Columbia, for export to Asian markets. If implemented, these two projects, much like the Trans Mountain expansion, would strengthen Canada's sovereignty, giving it much more negotiating room with a protectionist America. However, Canada still faces considerable internal opposition. Energy East and Northern Gateway were called down for many reasons, including a lack of federal government support, pushback from Quebec and Ontario, and environmental concerns. So it's been a challenge to get everyone on board, but Trump's rhetoric has changed the narrative. Now that Canada might face a trade war, the political discourse is open to more profound internal reflection. What was once unthinkable is now a matter of negotiation. If Canadian lawmakers can gather the needed consensus, they could build Energy East and Northern Gateway and strengthen the country's long-term resilience. As of now, though, it's all about impact. Suppose the standoff with Trump escalates and Canada starts having lines at gas stations, shortages, and other problems. In that case, Canadian lawmakers might decide that the security of supply is more important than some of the reasons they oppose those pipelines. However, the biggest barrier is who would pay for these pipelines, since the costs would be astronomical. While Northern Gateway is roughly the same length as the Trans Mountain expansion and thus would cost a similar $25 billion, Eastern Energy is 4 times the length, and so likely 4 times the price. What's more, the companies involved in these two cancelled pipelines, Enbridge for Northern Gateway and South Bow for Energy East, have no interest in restarting them. Granted, if no private company steps in, the federal government could, like it did with the Trans Mountain expansion. However, the only way the government can justify such expensive, controversial projects is if there is nationwide approval for them. If Canada decides to do this as a nation, it has the power to make it happen. But it's going to take a lot of lawmakers working in union to find common ground. It's been a long time since Canada has done that. With Trump in office, however, there is an opportunity to bring Canadians together. Recently, all 5 of Canada's living former prime ministers issued a joint open letter saying that they've witnessed the surge of Canadian pride and patriotism in the face of threats and insults from Donald Trump. So the Canadian leadership could bank on Trump's antagonism and use that to rally its public and build the energy infrastructure needed to secure its independence. After all, hostility builds bridges faster than diplomacy. I've been your host Shirvan from CaspianReport. If you approve of what we do, please leave a comment, hit the like button, and mayhaps share the video. In any case, thank you for your time, and Sawal.